and welcome back to the evening sessions of She the People's Women's Writers Fest. We are here today celebrating women writers and their works through our day-long festival. I'm here to introduce the speakers and the moderators for the next panel today. We're calling it Stories Ka Safar, where we talk about the stories and their suffered or their individual journeys and challenges of translation. We have with us today here Shahana Raza, who is a translator of Off the Beaten Track, the story of my unconventional life by Saida Banu. She's also Saida Banu's granddaughter. She has a master's in film and video production and has worked in television, radio, and other print media. A liberal feminist, Shahana is an independent writer and video producer. Shahana currently lives in Dubai with her husband and two children. We also have with us Saba Bashir, who is a poet, author, and translator. Her writings include a collection of poems, Memory Past, I Swallowed the Moon, the poetry of Gulzar, Andhi Insights into the Film, translation of Gulzar's screenplays of Premchand's Godan, Nirmala, and other stories, along with other pieces of fiction of Premchand and Sadat Hasan Manto. In conversation with them will be Shinjini Kumar, who is the co-founder of SALT, a platform for women buying financial products. Shinjini has studied English literature, journalism, and public policy and worked in senior roles in financial services. She's also the co-founder of Indian Novels Collective. Shinjini writes short stories and has been published by the Journal of Indian Literature, the Beacon Magazine, Out of Print Magazine, and others. I welcome you all on behalf of She the People today, and I hand over the session to Shinjini for moderation. Thank you.
Hi, I hope everybody's been having a good time listening to women writers. It's an important festival. I've tried to be at the festival every time I have had the chance. So thank you, Deepshika, for having us here, and I'm really pleased to be having a conversation with these two wonderful writers, translators. I'm not going to take much time. I'm going to just start out with a very simple question. We're talking about the Stories Ka Safar, and if both of you can just tell us where this Stories Ka Safar started for you, and what has it meant. And I'm going to start with Saba.
Hi, thank you, Shinjini. It's very interesting to talk about how it all started. My first book was a collection of poems, which came out in 2006. It was some pieces which I had been writing for some time. But the other important book which came out was I Swallowed the Moon, which was a kind of a compilation of my PhD thesis. So it was my doctoral work where I had looked at the poetry of Gulzar Sahab. I had looked at not only his film, but his non-film poetry. So, and after that, one thing, and that was the time when I really realized how I was enjoying translating, because I mean, whatever poetry that I had used for my thesis, I had to translate it into English also. And as one thing follows, and after that, I have been translating Premchand, and of course, I've done a lot of Gulzar translation. But the last book which came out in 2019 was the translation of Manto. And that was a little different from the other translations because over there it is, Manto has largely been associated with the partition stories, or he has been depicting women in the raw. These collections, these stories are in Loto, it was titled Shikari Orte. So these are bold, raunchy, fascinating, interesting women who are out to rule the world on their own terms. So, that's why it's translated into Women of Prey. I have a copy of my book here. So that's how, as you say, just one book after the other. And sometimes, you don't really plan these things and they just fall in place kind of a thing. And, you feel blessed that things have been falling in place.
So, like the cliche goes, you were chosen by these books and so on. And I have to tell you this, I just recently read almost 60, 70 Manto stories because I was looking for something particular. And it's fascinating the range that he has. I'm going to order that book that you just showed. It's a beautiful cover as well. So, Shahana, would you like to tell us about your Safar?
Yeah, the Safar for me began, my goodness, in 1997. My grandmother's book originally was published in Urdu as Dagar Se Hatkar. That was 96. Shortly after she had a stroke, and I used to go to visit her and read her mail or, just newspaper or whatever. And she asked me if I would translate it or read it. And I said, you've written it in a language that I don't read. I mean, I know Urdu, I am from Lucknow, but I don't read the script. So she, and like, this was also the time that I was leaving for the US. I was going there to work. So she had at one point, I went to meet her, and these 8 analog tapes were handed to me, and she had her friend read the entire book for me onto these tapes. So the Safar began there, and then these tapes traveled with me to the US. From there, I came to Dubai, where I settled. I, started working. She passed away shortly after I came here, and then, of course, I, became a mother. I lost my own mother, and all sorts of, things happened in my own journey as a professional before this happened. So, yeah, it was just like 3 years back that I could actually find the time and the wherewithal, because listening to those tapes was very difficult to try and, transcribe it myself. And because every time you press the pause button, the words get eaten, and then I would rewind. So I did like half of the first chapter and realized I couldn't do it like this. So I found a lady who helped me transcribe it. And so there were lots of many little mini journeys within this big journey.
Sorry, I was mute. I was reading the introduction. By the way, beautiful book again, very beautifully produced and written. I was reading that story about the tapes, and I thought your grandmother was a genius, because one of the difficulties with all of us in this country is that we're a country of very rich languages, and each language has its own literature, and it's also rich. We grow up listening to it, but very few of us actually end up reading them, because we all somehow go and read in English. And but the voice is familiar. So in our Indian Novels Collective, one of the things we decided early was that in addition to written translations, we would end up doing a lot of events, because when people listen to that story, we did a reading of Tisri Kasam, and a lot of people didn't even know that it was a very famous writer's very famous story. But when they heard it, then it kind of comes alive, because the language speaks to them in a different way. They may not read it in Hindi, but when they hear it, then it does something. So I wanted to continue with you, Shahana, to ask you this, and I'll come back to this theme of the Safar of translations and stories and feminism and tradition. But I want to start with you and understand that what was it like for you to go into your grandmother's world? Because she writes it's a very picturesque book. It describes very details of very little things. She brings alive a lot of things that existed in her time. A lot of that is, a lot of that sounds like it has changed now, and maybe you can't resonate, doesn't resonate with you, but a lot of that continues to do. So I'm curious for you to talk a little bit about what was your emotion when you went through this, in terms of what stays, and what is your responsibility as somebody who's bringing that to a much bigger world, right? Because she wrote for a different world, and you were taking it to a different world.
I think the first thing that kind of, because I was doing this as a, labor of love, but the first thing that actually, I felt hesitant a little about was the chapter when I came to her relationship with her husband, who is my grandfather, and she's written very candidly about that phase of her life. And though, of course, she and I had discussed all these stories, but, it's like, oh, you're driving somewhere and she's saying something, or we are eating and she says, oh, this happened. Or, it's not like you're reading this and it's all just, it's just you absorbing it all with nothing else to filter it off. So I had to kind of keep telling myself to be objective and detached, and, just kind of maybe like, how do I put it? Like, it was like, I'm a medium. I just had to, take this book from one language to the other. without feeling emotional about whatever was there, because a lot of it I kept thinking, oh my god, how would this be received? And then you also realize that a lot of people have different sides to their personality. So, and whatever I had heard of my grandfather was that he was a very loving father, he was a wonderful father-in-law, but maybe he wasn't stepping up as a husband. So that may have been there. And of course you realize that there are all these gray shades to people. Similarly, there's a bit about my own mother there. My mother, I mean, eventually my parents divorced, but I don't think Bibi and she, in those initial days, Bibi could understand what was going on with her. And reading about it, I mean, I had to take it with humor, because that was her perception of her, daughter-in-law. So you just have to. So I think when I approached it, that was the first thing that came to me. And the second was the language, because her Urdu vocabulary is not just any Urdu vocabulary. It's beyond belief excellent. So there were a lot of words. I would do it and I would do like 2 drafts or whatever. And I'd say, oh no, I'm not even close to what it sounds like in Urdu. So I would again, and throw out words that I knew, that I was familiar with, that I had some sort of little attachment to. So there was this constant process of sieving and expanding, but I told myself it's not like I have a timeline. So whatever time it takes, I need to just be able to do justice to what she said. And then there was Shero Shairi, there was Persian couplets, there's Urdu stuff. So there were little layers of all of that. And I, didn't want to over embellish it. I didn't want to make it very 2D. So it took me a long while to do this.
And it was worth it. It's a beautiful book, so that labor has been worth it. So Saba, obviously you will have a lot more to say about that process than I will be able to even fathom. So why don't you just get started and tell us about what is the translation process like for you, and what is rewarding about it? What's the responsibility?
See, I mean, the process of translation it's there's no hard and fast rule to it. And as we were talking earlier, also I teach translation also, which is also again a very different aspect, and one can never be happy with our own. I mean, we can never be happy with our own translation, because once we finish it and then even after the thing is published, we feel, oh God, I could have done a little better. But since the process of translation, and there are many people who are translating or who are getting into translation. It's not only knowing the target language or the source language. It's about the process actually when you successfully take the source language into the target language and manage to retain the cultural nuances of the source language. So, and that is what Shahana was also saying. It's very difficult, and that is the challenge, that you manage to retain the cultural nuances of the source language. And even when I teach, when with the students, and we in Jamia we've got a diploma, and we're starting an advanced PG diploma in translation. So it's like dictionaries always do not help. And one of my favorite example, and as a teacher, like all teachers, we have to teach the examples in each class. I always tell the students in the beginning class, I give them one sentence in English, that it's a Halloween party and something, and you've got a short story to translate. And the opening line is, the pumpkin was carved. Now, when you're translating into Hindi and Urdu, a sentence as simple as the pumpkin was carved, how would you do it in Hindustani? Because again, you are not talking about. I mean, it's just we know that it's Halloween, and then you can't put on so many things. So I mean, it's just a challenge, and just to scare the students a little bit, or actually make them more interested and more serious about it. But I'd like to add one more thing. I was having today morning itself, I was speaking with a professor in the Hindi department, and we were just discussing some translation, and I was trying to tell, so, students sometimes they look up the dictionary, and when they see synonyms, they think that they can pick up, and then, how to explain. And I was giving him the example, in Hindustani, in Hindi, in Urdu, we say channa. अब वो चाहे चाय छान रहे हैं या चावल छान रहे हैं या आटा छान रहे हैं, in English all छानना would be different, so, and sir just he said एक और है हाथ छानना. So now you really need to know that that's an idiomatic reference, and you need to know when हाथ जानने का क्या मतलब, and then when you're trying to translate into English, it's a different ballgame altogether. But even in the process, since I have translated a lot of Gulzar and Manto, which I'd like to talk about. But with Gulzar Saab, it's the imagery which was most difficult to translate because Gili Hasi. I mean, and especially in poetry, it was a big challenge. And in Manto, the idiomatic references were just too much. I mean, there is a little story in Shikari or they where two men are standing and they see कुछ वहाँ, there's a pile of melons and he said, अच्छा अब आप ही रंग बदल रहे हैं. Because वो खरबूजा देख रहे हैं, then the sentence comes in the past कि आप ही रंग बदल रहे हैं. So now
Yeah.
as since we are familiar with it, we know खरबूजे को देख के खरबूजा रंग
Yeah.
बदल रहा है. But Urdu does not use it in entirety. And when we're taking it into another language, into
Yeah.
another cultural reference, so, I mean, these are the challenges, and one can never, as translators, one can actually never be very happy about our translation, so to say. But yeah, we navigated. I hope I tried to answer some part of your question, Shinjini.
No, this is wonderful. This is really wonderful. But you know what you're saying reminds me of another thing, which is very relevant to the subject that we are discussing, and that is literally the stories Ka Safar. Like, why do we read stories? Why do we read fiction? Why do we read things that are written by people that are not a part of our own culture? Because we will not necessarily understand all cultural references at the time, but there is this whole process of intuition which follows you along when you are reading something, which helps you. I have a very interesting personal story, and the reason I got interested in translation is because I grew up in a very small place in Bihar, and I studied in a Hindi medium school, and my school had a library where we had a lot of Hindi translations of Indian language books, because that used to be very easily available. And so I grew up reading all the Indian literature in Hindi, but also I grew up reading a lot of world literature in Hindi. So later on, I actually graduated in English literature. So later on, when I was reading the same books in English, I used to find it very interesting, because when I was sitting in that very little place where I didn't understand, I didn't know what a scone was, or I didn't know what I didn't even probably know what coffee was, and I was reading about these things, and I read Dr. Zhivago in Hindi, and books like that. And then later on, when I was reading them in English, and later on when I traveled, so I've realized that the same book and the same story continues to interpret and reinterpret itself for you, and it stays with you. So that suffer that the story has with you is also a very interesting thing as a reader. So it's not just for you because you're engaged in that craft of creating that world, but it is equally important for the reader to keep in mind that it is a suffer, which is not, the story will just stay with you. Some of them will make a tiny little dent on your soul. Some of them, something will make a scratch. Some reference will make you laugh, but it will stay with you, right? Like, how many people actually see a gun, but you read books, right, that are about guns and violence, and so I want to bring that attention to the story part, right? So when you are, and especially in feminist literature, because what has happened is that's kind of not such a big wide world. There is also a little bit scarcity in that sense, right? And now you can discover a lot more, because there are a lot of narratives that have not been discovered earlier. Some have and some haven't, etc., etc. So I wanted to ask you, when you are looking through this literature and translation from the lens of feminism, how do you select what is relevant? And this is to the question of saying, somebody will say that, oh, but women today don't have those constraints. They can do a job. They're not limited to the courtyard. But how do you then, how do you interpret that as a writer and a translator? Both of you. I think, Saba, you can continue, and then I'll ask Shahana to answer the same.
Yeah, see, the issues are there. I mean, there are different issues, but different issues are there. And when we are translating, we are translating texts which were written earlier. So, of course, and in terms of retranslating or translating something which was written 60 years ago, we look at the language of today. And of course, the issues are of a different. For example, I just finished reading Manu Bandari's translation, Vidya Pradhan's translated The White Woman and Other Stories. So now this was written in the 70s and 80s. So it was the middle class woman, and she's trying to, set out. So we might not actually resonate so much with the issues, but overall, the depiction of the woman is universal and it still remains. So, I mean, and that's what I would say. I mean, they might differ to some extent, but it definitely remains the same.
Sure. How about you, Shahana?
I think it's very important now that I am looking back at this after doing this book. That one again, there's so many little cultural influences that go to make that one character. So if you yourself are not familiar with that background, uh, then you have to, like when I did the chapter for Bhopal for her. I'm from Lucknow. I've stayed in Delhi, so I understood all that YWCA and Ashoka Road and all that bit I understood. But I did my own little reading of Bhopal, of what it was like, what the court was like, what the women were like, because they were very emancipated. They were,
Yeah.
it was the only state ruled by women. So there's so many voices that kind of it's like a tapestry. You have to fit it all together, and it's really important that you don't see it from just one perspective and try and literally, otherwise you can fall into the trap of what a lot of Persian translators now are saying they feel about Rumi, that he's been sanitized and whitewashed, and he's been made to fit into this Western narrative by removing certain things that are like a lot of his poetry is very Islamic. It's so, but those things, it's all been made into more imagery and emotion than it is about his identity as a Muslim. But that's because it was convenient to do that.
Yeah.
So especially in BB's book, my grandmother's BB, I mean, for her throughout, there is it. I don't know if she did this consciously or not, but at every step, it's about, she compares men with women, how women servants were paid, how male servants were paid, what men were allowed to do as hobbies, what women were not,
Yeah.
what it was like for a male producer in AIR, what it was like for a female producer. So you have to. I think that it itself kind
Yeah,
of answers.
what you said about Rumi also reminded me. A lot of this gets done in the context of sex, right? Like everybody decided that all sexual imagery was about human and God because it was hard to imagine that people could actually express sexuality, right? So yeah,
Yes.
so some of those filters I think are there and they come about, and then I guess as a writer translator, you do try to deal with them consciously, is what I'm hearing
And
from you.
as
As authentic.
authentically, like not trying to give it what you think it should be, your interpretation of it.
Yes,
Just
yes,
let the
yes,
author's voice speak
yes.
uh, through.
Yes, and I guess somebody asked a question about the importance of reading translations, and I want you to quickly comment on that because we don't have much time left, but I think that's an important question. And to me, it's always been because if I can see that the same thought is reflected or a similar thought is reflected in so many different ways in so many different languages, then that helps me to come up with some point of view, because otherwise I may just be uneducated, right? Or I may just have my own biases, etc. So, but how would you respond to that question, the importance of reading translation?
See, you only
I
need a, sorry, sorry.
Go ahead, Shahana, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, when I mean my kids try to read this book, they're still reading it, and I tell them it's like you sample different cuisines. It's a global world. If you want to know what Mexican tastes like and what Thai does, or you want to know, we have here Azerbaijani food or whatever, it's similar. You need to know what other languages, how people thought, what their culture was. It's like a sampling of that culture through this book or
Beautiful.
through
Yeah,
any book.
because
So to me,
wonderful.
I mean, that's the example I give them. That
Lovely. That's lovely because it is, after all, language is the flavor. Saba, please.
Yes,
Your,
I completely agree with what Shana was saying. And to add to that, when you can read an original language, a text in the original language, then you read that. But again, then we are always, constrained to read just a small portion. And even not talking about the global literature. I mean, if we look at the languages within the country, to be able to read the literature from our own land, the only way is this translation, and that's something which we always, I mean, that's a question which has always been asked. And something is always lost. It might be, but there is always more gained in translation. You ultimately manage to carry forward a piece of text to so many other people.
Yeah. So Hemant, if there are any questions, can you please show it, because we have little time. Okay, what are the basic challenges you faced as a professional writer? That's a question from Dipanvita, and yeah, please, Saba, would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, sure. See, as a professional translator, I mean, these are the challenges, and sometimes there are contexts where you really have to, like, for example,
I think her question was about being a professional writer. I think I have a feeling that somebody who's a writer is asking that question. You faced as a challenges you faced, your story as a professional
as
writer.
a writer to get a book published. That is the biggest challenge,
Sure.
to approach even after when I have a couple of books. Even then, when I have a new idea, to approach a publishing house and then to give the synopsis and to that is the challenge. Writing is the fairly easier part, I think.
How about you, Shahana?
I think for
Challenge.
me, it was taking the time out because I work from home, and I realized during this process that I have noise intolerance. So there was, to me, that was the biggest challenge, was just trying to, cordon voices and sounds off so that I could just concentrate on words and, you know,
Sure.
finding where I'm going.
Sure. So I'm going to just quickly ask you a couple of more questions before we say bye. And they are easy questions. But tell me, what are you reading currently, and how do you pick up your book? Like there's so many books. Saba.
I mean, I generally read when when you've got a deadline. Half of the time you're reading because what you have to read. But in terms of pleasure reading, I just finished a book. It's an interesting one, the Babla murder case. I don't know if you've heard of it. It's again based on the true story with some very a controversial murder that happened in 1925 in Bombay. So it's a historical fiction kind of a thing, and it's written by the Kulkarni. He's a journalist. Very interesting book. So by and large, it's you pick up a review, you like a book, and then again half of the time I'm only reading what I'm supposed to read because because the profession demands it.
How about you, Shahana?
I'm currently reading Kishwar Desai's book on Devika Rani,
Uh-huh.
Longest Kiss. And it's long pending because I had told her I would read it, and finally it came, because I don't think it's in the book. It came from India. Somebody came and got it for me, so I'm reading that.
Wonderful. Oh, lovely. That should be lovely. I'm reading a book called The Bullshit Jobs, because I think I've done those jobs for a long time. But yeah, so and for me, picking books is easy because my husband's a professor and my boys read a lot, so I always have a lot of books in the house. So I just pick up whatever. I'm very lucky that way. Tell me, when this lockdown gets over, which is the first place you'll go to? Shahana?
Home, home, India.
So I hope that happens soon. Hope to see you here. Sabah?
I'm not sure, Shinjini. I've got very comfortable being in the
Yeah.
house. And for all these years, I had been working crazily, going at one days, second days, pick and drops for the daughter and all of that. I think the other day I was saying, now, I mean, I did go to work yesterday, there was a meeting, but then, now it looks it's a task. Get ready and would go out for a couple of hours. I think I've just got to settle being a
And
home
deal
girl.
with the traffic. Yeah, and deal with the traffic. Yeah,
So
yeah,
I really
hard.
don't know. I don't know what about it.
Yeah. No, so wonderful. We are done with our time, but I think I also want to ask you one question. Is there any new habit you picked up in this last couple of years of being home, apart from all your work?
To take
Sabah?
it easy. I mean, for the lockdown, if you're asking, yes, one thing which I consciously learned was to take everything easy. Again, I was practically working for the last 10, 12 years crazily. So it's just, breathing
Good.
and taking it easy. That's one lesson which
Wonderful.
this COVID period has taught us.
Shahana, you get the last word
Okay.
before we wrap up.
I think I've started listening to a lot more of music. So even when I'm cooking, I'm listening to music. If I'm kind of
Nice.
puttering around, I'm listening to music, and I'm enjoying that a lot. A different
Good.
kind of music. So one has
Wonderful.
the time now to do it because you're more at home.
Wonderful, wonderful. So I do want to, say a big thank you, and it's really been a pleasure. I think we could continue to go on, but this is the time allotted for us. Hemant, Deepshika, are you there? Can we go on?